This is Redefining Trade, the podcast brought to you by TradeWindow to shine a light on the future of trade. Every month, our host Peter Foyston will be joined by those who are shifting the dial for trade across New Zealand, Australia, and Asia. We will be exploring the latest thinking on trade innovation, supply chain management, export trends, digital trade, blockchain, trade law, trade in the face of COVID-19, and we'll be opening a whole new window on the world of exporting.
Today our guest is multi-talented David Downs. David's background makes him really hard to put in a box, but suffice to say, his resume includes more than a decade as GM at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, helping emerging New Zealand enterprises crack into global markets, regional leadership roles for Microsoft, and the author of 3 books on the history of innovation in New Zealand. David has also worked closely with Agritech NZ for the New Zealand Agritech Story, launched in 2019. This was part of a wider initiative to accelerate growth to the agritech sector for New Zealand. David's current role at NZTE is General Manager of Projects, and today I'm going to pick David's brain for what drives people and firms to innovate, how our New Zealand food and ag sector is embracing technology, and what he's learned about taking companies global. So David, it's great to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Kia ora.
So, Dave, you've had a really interesting career and some super experiences working with different organizations in the lead up to your current role with NZTE. It would be certainly helpful if you could maybe a brief rundown, a bit more context to what I just quickly covered over.
Okay, cool. I'll give you the very short version because otherwise we'll be here for a long time. But the short version is I went to university but dropped out after 18 months because I found much more interesting things to do. And they were...
Your parents must have been thrilled about that.
They loved it because I was about to be the first of my family to graduate. And then I had to ring my mother and say, I'm going to drop out of university to become an actor because the world needs actors. And anyway, so I became an actor and did that for about 5 or 6 years. Professional actor, by the way, which, by the way, means you get paid more than minimum wage. But that was in Wellington and then Auckland. And then after five years or so, my then girlfriend and soon to become wife decided we would get married, and one of us better get a proper job because she also worked in television and film. And so I set up a business and my own IT company, actually, a bit of a precursor to TradeWindow because we did a bit of work in the kind of in the idea of trade and commerce. And it was around the time of the deregulation of the power sector in New Zealand, and we wrote some software. Believe it or not, I went from being a comedian, stand-up comedian and actor to writing software for power billing systems.
Well, sometimes your electrical bill is a bit of a
It's a bit of a joke.
Yeah, it is. I'll tell you that.
Exactly. So, I set that business up and with my brother-in-law and a friend, and we ran that for about 5 years. And at the same time as that, I set up a bar in Auckland. Because
you had enough time in 24 hours in a day.
Exactly. There's a bit of a consistent theme in my career, actually. I tend to do 2 things at once. Then after doing that for a few years, my wife and I and then one child moved to Ireland, where we lived in Dublin for a while.
A beautiful city?
Yeah, I wanted to get over there. It was the time of the Celtic Tiger, just around the 2000s, .com boom. It was all going on in Europe, and we wanted to go and see what that was like. And I worked for an innovation tech companies over there and learnt sort of the European way of doing business.
Yeah.
Came back to New Zealand after a couple of years because we wanted to have more children. And
that sounds like your typical Kiwi story.
Yeah, exactly. But we weren't pulling pints in a pub in London and going to all of the drinking festivals. But yeah, came back to New Zealand, and then I ended up getting a job with Microsoft that you mentioned earlier. Completely unqualified, by the way. If you're following along, I still don't have a degree at this point. I'm unqualified. I'm pretty good at bullshitting, frankly. And anyway, Microsoft hired me, and I ended up working there in New Zealand for about 8 years, and the succession of roles in the professional services part of Microsoft, like helping implement, large-scale software. We're all at the enterprise side,
right? Yeah,
including with banks and that sort of thing, and some of the larger New Zealand companies. I ran the marketing part there for a little while, and then they offered me an opportunity to transfer it to the Singapore office, and which was quite exciting. And so by this stage, we'd had 3 kids. Still quite busy, and we moved up to Singapore and spent a few years there, based in Singapore, but travelling around the region. And my job was looking after the emerging markets, they were called.
And what do they count as emerging markets at that time?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's I don't know if there's a strict definition, but it was Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Brunei, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Malaysia. There's probably some more.
Well,
There were 11,
some
so I've
pretty
only got
good
9 then.
mileage points, I think.
Oh,
along the
well, that
way.
was the problem. Herein lies the problem. I flew up, moved my whole family, put them in school, and when I first went there, I said, I'll just be away 2 or 3 days a month. I'll need to go somewhere. Well, how wrong was I? Because I get there and then every week I needed to travel. And they're little trips, they're 2 or 3 hour flights and then back for the weekend sort of thing. But every week, 2 or 3 days a week away, often in 1 or 2 countries a week. And it reached a crescendo one day when my wife rang me up and said, can you get some milk on the way home? And I said, I could, but I'm in Jakarta.
Yeah.
And she said, I thought I saw you this morning. And I went, no, I was in Ho Chi Minh City this morning. So we went, something seriously wrong here. We've got to go back to New Zealand. But during my time and this is sort of pertinent now to the next bit of the story, during my time living in Asia, I just loved the idea of helping businesses. So my job was to fly in as the sort of the big, regional director.
Right.
Help the local subsidiaries of Microsoft help their customers. And along the way, I bumped into 3 or 4 New Zealand businesses who were doing trade up into those markets, into the Philippines or into Vietnam and places like that. And I always, because Kiwis, we go out for a beer after work, whatever, and I was curious about how they're doing business and what help would they need. And I ended up helping one company get established into the Philippines because I knew some people there that could help them out. And so when we decided to come back to New Zealand, I actually contacted NZTE and said, I want to come and work for you guys.
Cool.
I'm sort of done with big tech.
Yeah.
I loved it, but can I work for you? And they were great. And they said, well, we don't quite have the right job for you, but sure, come and join and something will work out. And it did. Within I moved back to New Zealand. Within about 2 months, they gave me a different job, and I ran their professional services part of NZTE for many years, and just loved it. So it was a really good mix of this international experience that I'd had in both in Europe and in Asia. And then being able to apply that back to the thing I was really passionate about, which is growing New Zealand, because I'm very passionate and patriotic. So it's been a great mix, and I did that for about sort of 8 to 9 years, and then I had my next career, because I think of my life in a series of careers. Unfortunately, my next career was to be a cancer patient, because at the age of
the toughest one.
Well, it wasn't one I applied for.
No one does. No one does.
But yeah, I got diagnosed with lymphoma, which is a blood cancer.
Yeah.
Just one day, literally, but busy at work. By that stage, I was running NZTE's kind of internal operations, like the chief operating officer type thing. And then got a bit under the weather and went to the doctor and then discovered I had cancer. And the short version of that story is I ended up being off work for about 18 months. And battling what was terminal cancer at one point. I was told I had less than a year to live, and ended up having to go to America for treatment. A whole nother story about that. Anyway, that's another bit of my life. But luckily for me, I got this incredible treatment, genetic modification treatment. So I'm actually a GMO. Came back to New Zealand, went back to work, went back to my desk after 18 months of being away, and after about 2 or 3 days, I went, I don't really want to be here.
Right.
Not that I don't want to be here at all. I love it.
No, but a life-changing experience probably
experience.
makes you say, what else can I do that's a bit different?
Yeah.
Where can I apply those
Correct.
skills? And
I'm very lucky to have a fantastic boss at a great organisation. And so I said to them, look, the best scenario would be, could I do 2 or 3 days a week working for you? And then I'll do 2 or 3 days a week doing other things, like some charity work and some board director stuff, and that's basically been my life for the last 2 or 3 years now, as sort of part-time NZTE, which is wonderful. I'm doing the stuff where I can add value,
right? And
then working with MB, you mentioned about Agritech.
Yeah,
that was a project they got me in, and then doing a whole bunch of other sort of stuff with different organisations. So that's my
I'm exhausted just listening. Exhausted and feeling a bit unworthy.
Not at all.
In fact, the one thing you also haven't mentioned, which I want to talk a little bit about, and this is something you've got one of your latest books, and I mentioned you are the author of 3 books, so there's 3 more books than I've ever been able to even consider. You now have one coming out. It's called Silver Linings, I understand, which sounds like something I'll use in this kind of COVID-19 interesting times.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about this. Is your chance to plug it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just go down the barrel here. Buy my book. Buy
some for your friends.
Buy multiple copies. They're really good to prop up wobbly tables. No, it does relate to COVID, because during the COVID lockdown, so we all went home, and during that period I set up a little charitable business called SOS Cafe, and what the model there was, I was thinking about the cafes around the road from me, and gosh, they're all going to go out of business because there's no one coming. So I contacted them and said, can I buy a voucher from you guys online? And they said, we'd love you to, but we can't. We don't have the facility. We've never set up a website. And so I said, well, I can do that. Like, I'm an ex-techie. So I jumped online. This is literally sort of the day that we went into lockdown. And I set up a website to sell vouchers for the cafes in my area. If you fast forward about 2 weeks, we've suddenly had 1,000 cafes. In fact, it ended up with being nearly 3,000 cafes, and we did multiple millions of dollars of transactions.
Kiwis do love their cafes,
They
so
loved
I guess
it.
I shouldn't be too astounded.
Yeah, but it was so cool. We just had all these people buying, $20 vouchers for their local cafe, which, as it transpires, just as an aside, only about a third of them have been redeemed.
Well, yeah, that's the perfect thing about vouchers,
isn't
it?
Yeah, we don't really care. But it's been amazing. So because of that, I was really busy running this sort of thing while I was trying to do a day job, by the way. And anyway, that gave us, me and a friend of mine, Joe Davis, it gave us a bit of an idea of, look, there are actually some positive things coming out of COVID. And the more we started looking, the more we realised there are actually some quite good stories. I mean, yes, definitely people have had challenges, but there's actually some good things. And so we thought about writing up this idea of what are these silver linings, like the SOS business and cafe thing I set up was one, the work that he was doing was a company called Nano Girl was another, where they had to pivot their entire business in a 24-hour sort of thing. And so we ended up writing this book during COVID, and Penguin's publishing it. It'll be out March, the middle of March sometime.
And will be available where?
At all good bookstores
As
and
always.
online. If you Google it, it's already online. If you Google it now, you'll find Silver Linings, and it's about 80 stories of positivity and optimism from that time of COVID.
Wow! Now that's pretty inspirational, because of course COVID and I would say that the New Zealand experience of COVID has been pretty different from a lot of the world's experience and what the world continues to experience. And I'm originally from Canada, and so I've still got lots of relatives back there. And so you really realize, yet again, just what a wonderful place this is to be, and how different our life is.
Yes.
Quote unquote normal. But in the book, which sounds super interesting, is there one or two kind of favorite stories that you'd love to share with us, especially because we do have a bit of a tech interest in the people that listen. If there were any that particularly had a tech,
cool. Let me tell you two quick
that
ones.
Would be good. And if there was something that was non-tech but super interesting, we'd love that.
I'll tell you two quick stories, and the book is full of stories. Like as I say, it's 80
don't
of them.
give us
I'm
all
not giving
80
I'm not giving 80.
purchase.
Right, story number 27. Two stories. One's tech, one's non-tech, but they're both sort of trade related. One is an amazing company called Halala Vanilla, who's based in Tauranga. They're a vanilla company, and what that means is they own or manage a vanilla plantation actually in Tonga, up in the islands, and they have done for many years, and they've worked in partnership with the local village. The Tongans grow this vanilla, and the New Zealand organisation markets it globally, and it's a really sought after, high value.
Yeah, super high value.
There's a lot of interesting stuff I could go on about. I learned a lot about vanilla writing this story. But one of the challenges they had during COVID was they were very worried about the workers. So, like many companies, and we had lots of stories of people who could change their production and start making hand sanitizer. And there's lots of stories in the book about hand sanitizer. So that's all cool. No disrespect, it's great. But Halala Vanilla made some hand sanitizer mainly just to send to their workers in Tonga. But what they thought they'd do is, just to make it a bit more interesting, they put a bit of vanilla flavouring in it. And then they started giving it to their workers and a few other people, and people going, actually, this is the nicest hand sanitizer, much better than the other one. And that made the Halala Vanilla people go, actually, maybe we're onto something here. And so they started creating a series of skin products and lotions and things like that had never been before, purely because of the COVID kick, and they gave them the materials, gave them the recipes and that sort of stuff. So they now have a very promising new business in skincare based on the positive things that came out of, and they sell that all around the world. So it's the trade bit. Here's a good tech story though. Animation Research Limited, Sir Ian Taylor, now Sir Ian, which is awesome, down in Dunedin. So they are the company that created the amazing graphics for the America's Cup and for many other sort of sporting competitions. And Ian tells the story about how they have the contract for the PGA in America, so the golf.
Right.
They do all the on-screen graphics. When the guy hits the ball, it calculates and it shows the graphics, and it's got these 3D flyers. It's very cool. And they had a year's worth of work lined up. It was beautiful. He said business was just humming, and then suddenly, bam, COVID. And they had about a dozen people in the States that they had to suddenly evacuate back to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. All the golf tournaments around the world got cancelled, and Ian thought, oh my God, that's it, we're over. Right. Shut down the business. The first thing he did, to his internal credit, because he's an amazing guy, was he told all the staff, you are all guaranteed a job until Christmas. And said, so forget that. And then he said, now what are we going to do? And it was an amazing thing because he said suddenly this huge innovation just started happening because people are going, well, if we've got a job till Christmas, let's get some stuff happening.
Yeah,
and
freeze the mind completely.
Yeah, we don't have to worry about our mortgage or our children's welfare. And one of the amazing things they did was they worked out that they used to fly to the US and do all their graphics sitting in a van, next to the cameras and the trucks on the golf tournament. On the golf arenas, and basically one of the clever people in the organisation said, all we need to do is basically lengthen the wires between the vans and us, and we could still do it. We just need it to go 11,000 kilometres around the world. So during COVID they trialled it and set it up and got it working, and they can now operate what they used to operate sitting in a van at Augusta or somewhere, sitting in Dunedin with a 16 millisecond delay, so a little bit, but nothing that anyone would ever notice. And it means everyone gets to go home every night instead of having to stay in a hotel. So it's been an amazing, technological innovation on top of the stuff they already do.
Wow.
Really good silver lining.
That is quite a silver lining. Okay, well, look, those are two great, amazing stories, and obviously this will help really build
and there are
people saying
78
there's a lot
more.
more. Absolutely, I bet. Even better than the ones you showed. I'm very confident of that. But that, it is particularly good in these times where people can really get down about stuff, and then they realize, necessity truly is the motherhood of invention.
That's right.
And a lot of really interesting things come out. Now, on the topic of COVID-19, unfortunately, the momentum of the virus does not seem to be slowing in any way, and this continues to come with lots of trade interruption. And what do you think needs to be done to help companies kind of move forward in this time, given we're kind of over that initial shock?
Yeah.
The rest of the world seems to be in a different place, so we're impacted on that. We're also impacted internally.
Yeah.
Give us some thoughts of just where you think companies could be what they could be doing, how they should be thinking as they work their way through something which I think will likely be with us for a period of time, regardless of the vaccination.
That's right. Well, I think we're in a really curious and interesting point for New Zealand. Because in many ways we are, the leading light in terms of our COVID response, which means that we are at the front of the curve in terms of experience what it likes to come out of a crisis. I mean, the world's not out of crisis. New Zealand's not out of the danger, but we're out of the crisis period.
Yeah.
And that's a really important note. There was a period there for New Zealand, it was about 6 to 8 weeks where it was crisis. Everyone just running around. Directors of companies are worried about liability. People are worried about cash flow. Everything's turned to custard. We've now moved on that, and now we're in the new normal. And we're one of the few countries in the world who are in this new normal. And so we can sort of reflect upon what does that mean, and I think be a bit of a leading light for the rest of the world. The key thing, NZTE, for example, one of the big things we saw after that initial response, which was around, just trying to shore up companies' cash flow, we started doing analysis with companies saying, what is it you're going to need? And the big thing was, how do they do international trade and go to market electronically? And for many years we've had as an example, for many years NZTE's had offerings about how to optimise your online presence or how to get on a digital marketplace or whatever it might be. But during COVID we saw the requests for that kind of help just skyrocket. Went from 10 or 20 a year to 500 in 6 months. So companies absolutely saw the need to connect with suppliers or customers, trade online, get their goods across the borders, and do it all hands-free or weightless. So it was a huge shift in the way that people think about it. If you think all those parts of that, sales chain, from customer empathy and understanding to dealing with distributors to post-sale service, every bit of it, you had to think differently. And so that's, I think, what businesses need to be really considering now is, for each part of your supply or value chain, what can you digitise? Where can you reduce friction? A little aside, and it sort of plays into what you guys do, I know, which is excellent, is during COVID we had these essential workers, and they were supermarket people and hospitals and doctors. One of the sets of essential workers were the bank people who do documentation for bills of lading and that sort of thing in banks. And I was talking to a mate of mine who's pretty high up in one of the major banks, and he said it was frankly a bit ridiculous. We were having to send people in to physically pick up bits of paper, take them places, get them signed. Couriers weren't working, so we have to. And it was just like it just highlighted how ridiculous it was that we've got this very analog part of our trade chain in the middle of it, and
well, I mean,
plays right into what you guys do.
You're talking to a convert.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
But that's one big, but obvious example. But that's happened everywhere. Post-sales service was another one. Lots of businesses are going, oh, how do we service our companies if we can't fly engineers and technicians or whatever it might be? So I think that's the key thing: is where can you optimize your whole value chain? And as I say, in New Zealand, we've seen lots of businesses move pretty quickly, and those that have moved fast and worked out how to do it and partnered with others and found organisations that can help them are doing pretty well, actually. I mean, knock on wood, but New Zealand's coming out of this pretty well. Not everybody, but many.
And since you kind of highlighted we're kind of at the front of this particular train, do you think there's any sense that we could see of longer lasting trends that will impact businesses beyond the whole digitization aspect? Are there other things you kind of see that will strengthen businesses, or the things that will change a little bit that might be the new quote-unquote normal now?
I think companies need to consider what the future, if you think about the broader market that you're in and who you sell, who are your end users of your products. One of the things that was a bit of a surprise was this parochialism that sort of globally has set up, where people are going buy local, support local. And that actually has had some impact on some organisations, where they're going, actually, for us to send our goods and services overseas when there's this now consumer sentiment is a little bit maybe different than it used to be, and so that therefore really need to understand your customers, and secondly, you need to be able to tell your story really well. We talked about storytelling in the intro. For me, it's a big part. New Zealand has a great story. We've always had a good trade story in food and beverage and things particularly. But now we've got this great story of this trustworthy, great place that we've come from. So we've got to think very cleverly about how do we reposition our products and services globally in a way that builds on New Zealand's fantastic reputation and understands the local market conditions. So it's even more important than ever to understand your end customer, I would posit. That'd be one of the key things I would say is going to have to be a new normal.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned about, now there's a bit of a dichotomy and friction between buying local, but New Zealand and Australia, for that matter, are both really driven by exports.
That's right.
And so it brings a bit of a challenge. And when you talk about how do we make the story more compelling, how do we make it seem like it's worthwhile for others? Do you have any other thoughts about how people could make their story even stronger?
Yeah. Well, you're playing straight into my hands, because there is the New Zealand Story Initiative, which is an organisation, sort of quasi-separate organisation, but it's part of NZTE, Tourism New Zealand and others, have been working on a program called Made with Care, just as an example. And Made with Care is about telling the New Zealand food and beverage story, the high-value food and beverage story. So again, one of the key things to really always think about in New Zealand, we're a tiny, tiny little part of the global market. There's no point in us trying to compete on volume or commoditisation of cost. We've got to think about how does New Zealand become a premium player in almost every niche market we play in. Food and beverages are a classic example where New Zealand food products need to be positioned in this high-value premium space. The Made with Care campaign that I just mentioned is something that came out of COVID, but it was the sort of thing we've been working on for a while through the New Zealand Story Group, which is to say, how do we leverage New Zealand's absolute advantages of distance, beautiful landscapes, incredible people, trustworthy place to do business. How do we build on that and say, right, and we've got food security, food safety, traceability where you need it, and you're selling then into a consumer base who's now much more aware about quality and willing to trade off quality versus cost. So that would be the key thing for us, is we're saying that New Zealand food and beverage companies in particular take this Made with Care campaign. It's a sort of an open source toolkit of images and videos and infographics and all sorts of stuff. Build on that, and that goes back to something I think is to the point about how to be successful post COVID. It's about collaborating. We use that. It's a bit of a buzzword. It's almost too much of a buzzword, but New Zealand's success can't be small subscale companies trying to do it all by themselves.
Right.
Like, it's just stupid.
Yeah.
They've got to learn how to collaborate and work together and build on others' work. And sometimes you might compete in New Zealand, but you're going to go to similar markets. You need to collaborate. So all sorts of things have to be a little bit different than they were before.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting mind shift, which is the people that I'm in the industry with. I'm really not competing so much against them per se. I'm competing against how do I create this big value
Yeah.
in the rest of the world, and that is a very different way that requires a lot of different thinking and skills. So that's really interesting. Actually, I've seen some of the work of the New Zealand story, the Made with Care, and some incredible photography.
Oh, it is. Yeah, we got some of that.
You thought I was crying before. It was something that really tugs at your heartstrings.
Well, that's the idea. I mean, why not? I mean, people, you would know this as a quick aside, but having done a bit of work to finish my life story, I did end up getting a degree, and I actually went to Stanford.
Oh dear! Now,
so anyway,
now it's all over.
Anyway,
sorry, parents.
One of the things I learned was humans are emotional creatures. So we might rationalise our decisions, but actually we're emotional. And when we purchase, either as a consumer, but even in the business space, most of our decisions are driven by emotional response. And so when you're selling a food product, you're not selling it on the calorific value or the fat content or the packaging. You're selling it on the beauty, the story, and the emotion behind it. And those are amplifiers of your story. So if you're selling a food and beverage product from New Zealand, you should be selling the provenance. You should be selling the landscape, the beauty, the history, the Māori culture. All of that gives this emotional context to this individual sales decision. And it sounds a bit, it can sound a bit woo-woo if you haven't gone down that, but it's now been really well understood in neuroeconomics. Many experiments in social sciences are showing that actually emotion-based selling is a really critical part of being successful.
Well, that is super interesting. Now, you've also done a lot with the food and ag sector in New Zealand. How do you think New Zealand stacks up on the world stage in terms of adapting technology? Yeah,
so the work that you're referring to there is for the last couple of years I've been leading a project for government around agri-tech. And
right. So that'd be the Agri-Tech Task Force.
The Agri-Tech Task Force,
okay.
Yeah, sounds pretty good, eh? We should get some uniforms. Yeah. But basically the story here is the government, the Labour government asked us, government agencies to really look at the New Zealand economy. And it was pre-COVID, but it's even more amplified the importance through COVID is we can't respond to COVID just through fiscal stimulus or through monetary policy. We actually have to grow the economy, and that's how you're really going to get out of this. And they said to us agencies, which sectors of the economy or subsectors do you think there's opportunity to grow faster? Agri-tech was one of them. So this is the technology used in the agricultural supply chain. And I was asked to lead this task force of multiple different agencies, working with the industry, industry players, working with research organisations. And we have over the last 18 months, but particularly in the last year, put together this program of work that will accelerate the success of New Zealand's agri-tech to the world. The quick version there is that New Zealand's always been a big agri-tech creator and supplier, but largely for our own use. That has been the secret of our success of our farming, our productivity on farm, is because we're quite good at creating technology to be more productive. The issue is that technology is applicable to the types of farming systems we use, but they aren't the predominant farming systems used in the rest of the world. And so one of the recommendations we've got is we need to broaden our look at the opportunity globally and also what we do to commercialise IP to take advantage of the global opportunity for agri-tech. So that's the work that we're doing at the moment.
And are there some, again, just getting, as you talked about, people love the emotion of things. Are there a couple of interesting stories about companies that are really in the forefront in the ag sector using technology which is groundbreaking around the world?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ag tech companies in New Zealand. You'd be hard to go past someone like Gallagher Group, for example.
Yep.
The history there is a classic New Zealand story. Bill Gallagher had a horse that was rubbing up against his car. He was a farmer and he stuck a battery on the side of the car and the horse got an electric shock every time it touched it, so it didn't touch the car again. And he went, oh, there's a product here. And he invented the electric fence. And, that was in the 60s or 50s. And then Gallagher Group now has become this global leader in agricultural technology and supply. And all sorts of, new innovations have come from that. They're one of the bigger players. You also get much smaller players who are doing really interesting things. You've got companies who are creating robots that go inside tanks, milk tanks, and other sort of aluminium tanks. They use suckers instead of magnets, for example, to test quality of the inside of a tank. Global opportunity for them. They're in the perfume industry and grain and all sorts of things. And so you've got in New Zealand, by our estimate, around about 1,000 companies, some very small, but many not, who have the opportunity globally to grow very successfully. And so what we're trying to do is work with those companies and say, where can you grow? Robotics is one area we've highlighted as something that we think New Zealand could have a real differentiation in. And we're doing some work at the moment around horticultural robotics. So for harvesting, packing, picking, that sort of stuff. Could New Zealand be the world's expert in horticultural robotics? That's kind of our opportunity statement.
Right.
Based on the work of lots of organisations. You've got people like Compaq who've been sorting apples and oranges for many years with these massive, huge machines the size of a football field. You've got Robotics Plus who have robotic platforms for picking, and they do scaling of logs and measurement of logs. You've got some of the universities and research institutes doing a lot of work with sensing and remote technology. So all these things come together, and we're saying actually New Zealand has the opportunity to really take a world leading position here. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to.
And what do you think has to, what do you think has to change, or what are the key factors that have to come together?
Yeah. So we wrote, as part of the work I'm doing, it's called the Industry Transformation Plan. There's a document that goes behind that, which is kind of the strategy, and it says, here's the things we perceive as being challenges and obstacles, and here's some opportunities. Just to give you a couple of those, for example, one is that we need to be thinking global. New Zealand businesses have been great at creating technology for pastoral-based agrarian dairy farming. Mm-hmm. So we've got great milk platforms, we've got great milking systems, but actually the world needs different things. The opportunity is bigger in the world for different things, put it that way. So that's number one, is think bigger and think global. The second thing would be we've got to think more around how do we speed up the commercialisation cycle. So we spend a lot of money in New Zealand on research and development and agri-tech at the CRIs and the research institute level and the universities. Very little of that comes out in terms of end products. That doesn't mean it's not valuable, it gets used in other ways, but we think if we compare ourselves to Israel, for example, which we love doing, usually we compare ourselves to countries because we want to feel superior, but sometimes it's good to hold a bit of a mirror up. And Israel spends about the same amount of money as we do on research and development in agri-tech, and they would commercialise or have about 50 companies a year spin out of that, and we have maybe one every 2 to 3 years. And so there's something very different in our settings that has to change. So that's one of the things. Historically, availability of investment capital has been a challenge.
It's a pretty small market.
It's a small market. New Zealand doesn't have deep investment pools. We have seen lots of activity lately, and particularly we've seen some offshore players invest into New Zealand businesses, which is good. It's a double-edged sword. We love it, and they create paths to market, and they create global pools of expertise. But at the same time, you want to see ownership retained in the country. So that's been a challenge that we're looking to address. We're looking at then there's some really deep and dirty stuff around, not dirty, but little deep and technical around data interoperability and the concepts of how do you switch data, going back to sort of what TradeWindow does. How do you really make it smooth to interoperate information between parties? Because at the moment there's some really broken parts of the system. So just
silos all over the place, which makes it so hard.
Standards that aren't being adhered to or don't exist. The end user experience is awful. If you're a farmer, you might have 3 different applications if you're lucky, and a book with a bit of paper, and you're out on your farm going, how can I manage what is essentially a very large business running with an Excel spreadsheet, an app, and a piece of paper? Like, it just doesn't operate. So there's some things like that we're trying to work out how we can solve as well.
Wow, and in terms of kind of the relationship between business, ag business, institutes, whether they're universities or other things, government support. Do you think that they're now realizing that they can, the areas of expertise that they can bring, and then collectively, individually they're 1 + 1 + 1, but collectively, because they can focus, they can turn into like 25?
I hope we're getting that's exactly it. In the industry transformation plan, the big point we make is that the ecosystem is the important bit. No individual player can be successful without the rest of the ecosystem. So you've got companies creating technology, you've got people using the technology, you've got investors investing, you've got research institutes creating IP, you've got government support, you've got all these sorts of different parts of the ecosystem, which historically New Zealand's not that great. Let's be really frank. We're a small population country in a physically quite large country, geographically dispersed, with a little bit of a suspicion of the other, and you end up, it's as a little aside, I've been around New Zealand, and I've had about 5 different parts of New Zealand say to me, David, we're really the food basket of New Zealand. And I go, I heard that in Tauranga last week, and I heard it in Christchurch the week before, and none of you are the food basket. We are all one big thing, and how can we interoperate and work together? We're seeing a little bit of that change now and shift, and we're trying to incent, collaboration a bit better. But that's one of our challenges is that if you're again going back to Israel, they're in a
Super compact.
they're in the size of the Manawatu, and they all can work together. We are spread much more thinly.
Oh, well, and are you finding that as you kind of consider the history of ag innovation in particular and innovation in general in New Zealand, is there something you think that kind of is uniquely Kiwi, or is it something that actually could be available and is available pretty much around the world? It's just a matter of some places can kind of put the pieces together better than others.
Yeah, we've got to be careful in New Zealand. We love the story of ourselves of the number 8 wire. One of my books.
Yeah, the number 8 wire.
One of my books was called Number 8 Rewired, and it's the history of New Zealand innovation. And we love that idea that New Zealanders can make things quickly. The truth of the matter is many countries have the same sort of rapid innovation and interesting, innovative people. And so we've got to be really honest and say, actually, we need to take the best of the number 8 wire spirit, and there are some great bits. We're really good at turning necessity into opportunity, as you said earlier. We're great at not following the rules in the good way. Like we challenge authority. We don't think, this is the only way to do something. We're really good at being multidisciplinary. So individuals can do a bit of this, bit of that, bit of this. That's just different. So we've got to take the best of that, but then we've got to add to it. You've got to add this international lens. You've got to really be thinking globally about your opportunity. You've got to learn to collaborate. So there's these things we could do to add to our core expertise. But I do think, I'm really optimistic. New Zealand's the agri-tech sector in particular in New Zealand has definitely got the opportunity to grow significantly.
And do you think that there's enough kind of human capital here in New Zealand to be able to drive that and enough interest? One of the things that struck me, coming from Canada, which has a fairly large agricultural industry, but it feels like here in New Zealand, the agriculture industry plays such a bigger role in the national psyche. Yeah. And is there enough there for us to be able to really drive forward? Because it seems to me a little bit, the individualism, the jack of all trades, if you will, trying to morph into something so much more. It feels like a really different skill set, and it'll be interesting, to not lose that kind of individualism and the fact that made it so successful, morphing into something different. Is there anything?
Yeah, it's a challenging one. This is my opinion now. My personal opinion, not government policy. This is all about. Not government policy. But I do agree with you.
Don't worry, I won't tell anyone.
I think one of the challenges we've got to make sure we don't vilify and make the farmers the bad guys, which I think we've tended a little bit. There's been a bit of a tendency, particularly our city folks, our city dwellers, who don't really understand the complexity of doing the sort of business that happens in farms. And we've got to make those jobs and roles attractive to lots of people. Unfortunately, the average age of a New Zealand farmer is like 61. They've definitely got issues with, intergenerational work. That the farm sizes are getting bigger because they're having to consolidate. So we do have to make sure that we continually make this an attractive part of the business of New Zealand economy that actually is valued for its huge contribution. I firmly believe that the agriculture sector will always be the most significant thing in New Zealand. And everyone can argue about tech. I think, don't get me wrong, I'm a tech guy, I've spent my life in tech.
Yeah, please,
tech will also be
tech.
But the two of them together is what's so brilliant. And that's why the agri-tech thing for me. We just have to make it attractive and build the sort of career opportunities. Agri-tech's wonderful because you can get mechatronics engineers and sensing technology and big data science. Another little quick aside, I met a guy in Tauranga who used to literally be a galaxy analyst in big data. So he took massive data sets of the universe and would plot where the galaxies were moving. He's now working in horticulture, where he's looking at clusters of avocados and kiwi fruit on vines. And he said to me, it's actually the same stuff. Like, we're using the same algorithms,
one is a bit
the same
easier
analysis.
To eat than the other,
exactly.
I think, but
one's easier to harvest. But he said, and I never thought of this as a career, but it's actually really fascinating. I can use the same skill set. So that's the kind of thing we need to be able to do.
And maybe that's also a little bit of mixing of, the countryside plus the city, because you can practically do tech anywhere, and tech can cross over a lot of different places in terms of what you're talking about, making that bridge happen, because that is important.
And that goes back to our COVID advantage again. One of the silver linings is that New Zealand is really well served when it comes to connectivity. Not perfect. It's not out into every valley yet, but But you can work in a very high-tech job in a relatively small part of New Zealand, and therefore you've got all these new opportunities open up. So I think, definitely one of the things we're focusing on in the industry transformation plan is skill development and career opportunities. But I actually think the bones of it are there. We've just got to start building the kind of the opportunity.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. Now, looking back in your career, and we've heard you've grown many businesses in many different ways, and your own startup, you're working at Microsoft and the regional development, and then in NZTE, you've been advice and support. So, what would you provide to a Kiwi or Aussie company that wants to set up to grow a great global digital business today? What would be the top 2 or 3 things that you think they should have kind of on the page in front of them as they sit down and say, now I'm going to start this journey? What are the 1, 2, and 3 things they should have in mind?
What's the recipe for success?
Absolutely, and I'm writing it down myself.
Cool. Jeepers, I didn't read these questions beforehand. I'll tell you, there's a couple of things. One is speed.
Yeah.
And this is something New Zealand companies really need to think more about as we move too slowly globally. The pace of business is much, much faster than we see in New Zealand. And we get a little bit lazy and complacent, and that's going to be insulting, I hope not. But because there isn't a lot of competition here, customers are pretty open and willing. You go to the rest of the world, things are happening at hyper scale. If it's not done and dusted in a month, so that's number one. Collaboration and working with others. Don't try and do the whole thing yourself. Just because you think you've got the skills doesn't mean you're the right person. And that goes to the speed thing. Many New Zealand business, we're both blessed and cursed by being the easiest place in the world to do business.
Right. So
New Zealand is the easiest. With $115 and 2 minutes, you can jump on the company's office and set up a new business. Like, there's no one in the world that can be like that. You can hire people, you can do whatever you want. The problem is that means we've got a lot of small businesses and not a lot of scale businesses. Because it's easy to set up a small business. It's even easy to sort of get it up and running a little bit. But getting it to scale requires a whole other set of skills that you probably don't have, You've got to bring in new people. You've got to collaborate with other people. So that'd be the second thing. And then the third thing is think global on day one. Don't think just New Zealand. That doesn't mean you be global on day one necessarily, but think global.
Like, that's a good distinction, because otherwise people are like, what? I mean, I just don't have that kind of... And there's lots of cases of companies that have particularly gone to the US and really struggled.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. It's think global, but not necessarily...
Be global. Yeah, I mean, you might be able to be global, but it's more likely that you're just going to go, right, what's the global opportunity in these markets, and therefore what's my 2-year plan? Okay, I'll do this, then I'll get there, then I'll do this. Because if you don't have that, you'll get stuck in this kind of medium, small business mindset. Whereas if you think big, think big from day one. So those would be some of the key things. And then the other bit we see is really taking the time to understand the consumers and the end users of your products.
Okay. Yep.
Don't assume you know it, and don't assume that they're like you, particularly if you're thinking global. I mean, you would know this. You're Canadian. Yeah. Like, you and I look the same. We sound similar, and yet the Canadian and New Zealand markets will be radically different.
Right.
In fact, there's a nice bit of analysis that was done that said something like the difference between the New Zealand and American market from a culture point of view, on whatever scale they use, is about the same as the difference between the New Zealand and the Thai market. Thailand. So you think they look like you.
That would explain why a lot of companies haven't had the success they thought in the US.
Precisely, because they just assume that they like us.
You shouldn't judge a book by its cover.
Exactly. They think that we know how to do business because they look and sound like us and we've watched American TV. That's not the case at all. So take the time to understand the end customer and consumer.
And just as we're kind of coming to the end here, you did mention, I think, at the very beginning, you were a paid actor, which is fantastic.
Fantastic.
And what kind of acting did you do?
Bad acting, which is why I'm not doing it anymore. But I was a comedian first did stand-up comedy and then sort of late-night TV comedy and that sort of stuff. This was in the 90s, so let's cut me some
So just a few years ago for both of us.
Just
like yesterday, really. Yeah. But is there anything, I must admit, I've always thought that, someone who's a stand-up comic must be someone who's just incredibly brave.
Yeah.
Because you're really putting yourself out there.
Or stupid.
And, let's say brave. Let's say definitely brave. And I think people starting businesses are also have to be incredibly brave. So is there any kind of crossover or thoughts you could leave
I love what
for us on the last, the last idea here? Because otherwise we could talk for hours.
So I think there's a lot of similarity between my early part of my career and my later part of my career. So the things I learnt when I was a stand-up comedian and an actor was creativity, resilience, bravery, storytelling and the way that you can kind of engage people through story. Those were things that you had to do. You did no choice. And interestingly, in business over the last 15 to 20 years, and particularly in the last few years, it seems like that there's this big resurgence. And I've got friends who are ex-stand-up comedians and ex-kind of theatre sports people who are now making really good money going and teaching corporates how to do the stuff we did on the stage 20 years ago. It's quite cool actually. So I think I'm very pleased that we've come back, and it goes back to that emotional piece.
Yes,
business is emotional.
Well, thanks so much for coming along, having a chat. We could go on and on, but I know you've got other things to do. I personally have really enjoyed it, and I hope the listeners and the viewers will as well. And what I would say is to our listeners and viewers, we'd love to hear any questions or suggestions you have for the Redefining Trade podcast. And look out for contact details in the show notes, or email us at redefiningtrade@tradewindow.io. And I just want to say a big thank you. Absolutely fascinating.
Right. Thank you very much. Ka kite.
This has been Redefining Trade by TradeWindow with our host Peter Foyston. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit subscribe and keep an eye out for the next episode.